And let's also not play fast and loose with figures, although Matt has done that in the past when he's falsely claimed that 50% of social housing in London goes to those who are not British. It was found to be 14%. Let's stick to some of the facts. Let's
48%.
look
Is
at the
it
facts.
48%?
No, 14%. You were proven wrong by Mehdi Hassan,
Or
actually, who
48%
rightly
of
got the
social
figures
housing in London.
from the London Authority.
48%.
And of course, only 4.
This is Professor Matt Goodwin schooling SNP flop Hamza Yusuf in a debate on immigration. It's interesting how Yusuf tries to discredit the professor's entire argument over him apparently getting the exact percentage of foreigners in social housing wrong. I don't know the actual figures, but I do know Britain's welfare system, healthcare, social housing, and everything else are open to the entire world to use. We are actively importing them and putting them before the British people. And that's a fact, not an opinion. I see it with my own eyes every day. If I were to become homeless tomorrow, I'd be on the streets unless I could afford private accommodation. Yet, I see women from Africa and the Middle East arriving with 4 kids and going straight into social housing. They've never paid a penny in tax, arrived yesterday, and take priority. Then we get we have an aging population argument. Never mind wondering why we aren't having babies. It's no big deal because Africa is breeding like rabbits, so we can just import them to replace the native population. That's a convenient solution for people like Yusuf. It's telling that Yusuf laughed when the professor said we need more pro-family policies. I've concluded that Hamza Yusuf, like the rest of the liberal establishment, pushes the politics of hatred for the British people. It's clear some of them see all this as payback for colonisation. People are only voting for reform because of falling living standards, Hamza tells us. But that's nothing more than I'd expect from people who believe Britain has no culture of its own. Just give us a house and some money in our bank accounts and we'll shut our mouths and happily welcome in Islamic law. Well done, Matt Goodwin. Here's the debate.
Well, I think there's probably a few reasons for it. First and foremost, this is not happening in a vacuum. You've had at least 20 years of normalizing rhetoric that was only ever really only heard by those in the hard right. So you would hear anti-immigration rhetoric from those in the fringes, and those now in power in Westminster over successive governments, be they Tory or Labour, have adopted language like British jobs for British workers, stop the boats, island of strangers. And therefore, normalising that rhetoric, I think, gives legitimacy to that rhetoric. What's also happened, and is significant, is over that 20 years, to use a Scottish word, people feel scunnered. They feel fed up, exasperated, because their living standards have dropped, had the biggest drop in living standards since records began when the Conservatives were in. And then Labour swept in with a promise of change, only to take money off pensioners, money off the disabled, and betray the WASPy women of pensionable age, who were promised compensation when Labour got in, but not given it. So you have these twin issues going on, where legitimacy of the language over the last 2 decades, a complete failure by political parties in Westminster to offer a hopeful alternative. And of course, populism thrives at a time of economic hardship, and it thrives on dividing the population into us versus them. And I'm afraid the them is now migrants. And we are seeing a rapid rise in reform to the point where virtually every single opinion poll in the last 6 months would tell you that if there's a general election tomorrow, Reform would be the largest party, which is deeply worrying, in my opinion.
Matthew, what do you make of Hamza's assessment there? Is it just that the rhetoric has been normalised, or do you think people are identifying with their policies?
Well, no, I completely disagree with what we've just heard, which is the view that it's illegitimate to worry about very real world historic shifts that are reshaping the country. It's not the rhetoric or language of politicians that are driving support for reform. It's the very real, very deliberate policy backed by the UK state, backed by almost all of the mainstream parties to impose mass uncontrolled immigration on the country, to lose control of our borders, to have 160,000 illegal migrants and asylum seekers enter Britain while breaking our laws, costing UK taxpayers upwards of £7 billion a year. Now, yes, economic insecurity and anxiety is part of that story, but it is entirely legitimate. It is entirely justified for the British people to say, we are not going to allow our politicians to impose what is an extreme experiment supported by only 10 to 15% of people in Britain to allow millions of people to migrate into the country, more than 80% of whom are coming from outside of Europe, with no serious plan for how we're going to integrate these people, for how we're going to support our national economy, and how we're going to continue to maintain our public services. That is why people are voting reform, because the establishment has imposed on them this project which nobody voted for.
Hamza, what do you make of that? Is immigration at the heart of everyone's concerns here, or is this just a scapegoat issue that reform knows is popular with a certain segment and it also gets headlines in the media?
Well, let's first of all, I think, try to deal with the issue and the notion that Nigel Farage is somehow anti-establishment. The man is a multi-millionaire. He is as part of the establishment as you can get. And let's also not play fast and loose with figures, although Matt has done that in the past when he's falsely claimed that 50% of social housing in London goes to those who are not British. It was found to be 14%. Let's stick to some of the facts.
48%.
Look at the
48%.
No, 14%. You were proven wrong by Mehdi Hassan, actually.
48%
rightly
of
got the
social
figures,
housing in London.
London Authority.
48%.
And of course, only 14% was the figure, of course, of social housing that went to those who are not British. But let's deal with some actual facts on the ground. By 2050, the UK will have a dependency ratio of 1 in 4 people over 65. That means we are going to have, and we have, a huge working age demographic time bomb. We also know that by 2050, in both the UK and the European Union, that they will need approximately 45 million workers to sustain our public services. So far from being a burden on our public services and our social services, migrants, whether they're the 30% who are not British, who make up junior doctors in England, whether they're those who are in social care, or indeed in the private sector who are working in our hospitality and retail sector, this country needs migration, not uncontrolled migration, by the way. There's no sensible person, I think, in this country, and certainly no politician, that argues for uncontrolled migration. There has to be controlled migration. But my goodness, this country's economic prosperity, as well as the European continent's economic prosperity, relies on migration. How on earth are we going to prosper when this continent needs 45 million workers between now and 2050 if we bring up the drawbridge and don't allow people to come here, upskill them, yes, give them lessons and opportunities to learn English. But this country has required immigration, currently is being propped up by immigration, and needs immigration in the future.
Matthew, how is the country going to deal with what Hamza's describing as a working age demographic time bomb?
Well, there's absolutely no doubt that every Western nation is facing a demographic crisis. I would completely agree with that. But the way that we're going about trying to solve it is absolute lunacy. Every major study that we've now got on the fiscal effects of migration on Western economies shows that the very kind of mass migration we're pursuing, which is mainly low skill, low wage, poor levels of education from outside of Europe, is a net fiscal cost, not a net fiscal benefit. Even the Office for Budget Responsibility in the UK now concedes this point. Even Keir Starmer, in his speech a couple of weeks ago, now concedes this point, that this experiment is not only undermining our prosperity, it is also making things like the housing crisis worse, undermining wages of workers. The workers are people on the left of politics used to care about, but they no longer do, because feeling morally righteous is now more important to the left than actually delivering an economy that works. What we are doing is we are pushing people into a Ponzi scheme. It's a population trap, because what Hamza did not mention there is that, guess what? Migrants get old too. They also use the welfare state. They also use public services. So if our answer to the demographic crisis is let's just keep having more migration, and by the way, let's keep having more low-skill migration, that is not the answer. The answer to this problem is a limited amount of genuinely high-skill migration, which is what politicians promised the British people. Labour politicians and Conservative politicians, they didn't deliver that. They lied to the British people. At the same time as we invest in pro-family policies in the UK, and we encourage people from these islands to have more children. That's a twofold response that we need. That's what Israel's been doing. It's what Hungary and Poland have been doing. The evidence so far is a bit mixed. But we need to do what we did with smoking and the environment. We need to fundamentally change the culture in this country, so we are incentivizing people to have more children, and we are supporting British families, not making life harder for them by saying, well, mass immigration is the answer. That is not the answer to this problem.
All right.